Welcome to Somnotales History, a place where the restless mind finds rest, where history, mystery, and science become gentle stories told in the hush of night. Here, we don't just tell tales, we guide you through worlds shaped by silence and soft wonder. Tonight, we journey into a forgotten world, in the quiet northern lands, where the stars moved like thoughts and the wind carried memory. The Vikings lived in deep harmony with sleep, not as a ritual, but as a rhythm, a listening, a remembering. This is not a story of battles or bloodshed. It is the calm unfolding of a hidden truth, that the most well-rested civilization in history may not be the one you'd expect. So close your eyes, let your breath slow, and follow the spiral back to the time of watchers and whispers, and the deepest sleep the world has ever known. In the dim blue hush that settled over the snow-laden hills of the north, long before the modern world began measuring time in glowing numbers and constant alerts, there lived a rhythm deeper than any clock. A rhythm felt in the bones, understood by the wind, and obeyed by the stars. It moved through the hearts of the Norse people, not as command, but as presence, unspoken and immovable, shaping every breath they took through the endless winter nights and the pale summer dawns. This rhythm was the quiet law of sleep, not merely the closing of eyes, but the yielding of self to the deeper stillness of the world. In a village pressed against the spine of a fjord where the mountains plunged sharply into the sea, there stood a longhouse that had stood through 60 winters, its roof sagging slightly from snow, but still firm, still breathing the heat of the hearth into the dark. This was the home of Arnketil, a woodworker known not for war or wealth, but for the silence of his hands. He rarely spoke unless the fire was low or the children had fallen asleep, and when he did, his voice came like the slow drip of melting ice, steady, inevitable, and older than it sounded. He lived there with his wife Ellen, her hair silver now, but her voice still sharp when needed, and their grandson Snorri, whose feet had just begun to outgrow his boots. Arnketil's son had died 3 winters ago, taken by fever that no herb or prayer could drive out. Since then, Snorri had lived between dreams and the quiet rituals of a man too old to chase foxes and too young to give himself fully to the grave. In this space between lives, they found each other. Night fell early now. It was midwinter, the sun barely crested the hills before retreating again, leaving the world painted in long shadows and silver light. The longhouse glowed faintly from within, not with the harshness of flame, but with the red pulse of coals banked beneath ash, a soft heart beating in the darkness. Outside, the snow fell in long, lazy strands, drifting sideways in the wind's whisper. No one was outside now, no one needed to be. The land itself had lain down to rest. Inside, the 3 of them sat near the hearth. Ellen mended a tear in a wool tunic, her fingers moving slowly, her eyes half closed, as if the thread remembered its path better than she did. Arnketil was sharpening a blade, not because it needed it, but because the rhythm of stone on steel soothed something in him that words could not. Snorri, barefoot and wrapped in a reindeer hide, stared into the coals, his eyelids heavy but stubborn, as if sleep might miss him if he surrendered too soon. "It's time," Ellen said softly, not looking up. Snorri didn't argue. He slid down onto the fur pile near the wall, pulled the hide tighter around his small body, and let his breath slow. No candles burned, no lamps. The glow of the hearth was enough to see, enough to dream by. Arnketil placed the blade aside, covered the sharpening stone with cloth, and moved to his own place. He did not speak. He had no need to. The longhouse creaked faintly, not from age, but from memory. It remembered every winter it had endured, every storm, every birth and death, and all the nights in between. The wind outside changed tone, not louder, just different. It brushed the walls like a hand, not to test them, but to remind them it was still there. Then even that sound faded, and there was only breath. 3 breaths, each at their own pace, and the slow, slow crackle of a log sinking deeper into ember. And sleep came not rushed, not forced. It came as the night did, full and without apology. It wrapped around them like the hides they slept beneath, not pulling them down, but inviting them inward. Arnketil dreamed of ships. Not of sailing, but of building. He dreamed of shaping timbers, of soaking planks in steam, of driving bronze nails through wet oak. He felt the resistance of the wood, the smell of pitch and salt, the sound of gulls wheeling overhead. But he did not see the sea, only the ship, its ribs rising like the bones of a sleeping creature, its hull gleaming faintly in the low sun. Ellen's dreams were thinner, like silk veils fluttering in wind. She dreamed of a song her mother used to hum when she combed her hair. The tune was faint, like something sung by snow as it fell, and she couldn't quite catch the words, but the feeling of it was enough warmth, stillness, a hand on her shoulder. Snorri's dreams were louder. They came in bright shapes and muffled roars. He ran through the trees, barefoot and laughing, chasing something he didn't need to catch. The snow didn't slow him. It lifted him, carried him. He shouted into the branches, and the trees answered with long, deep groans of ice. And somewhere, not in a dream, but in the world outside, the moon rose. The moonlight filtered through the cracks in the wood, and the translucent cover stretched across the small upper vent, casting a faint silver glow that barely reached the edges of the sleeping space. The cold did not enter, but the light did, pale and silent as memory. For a while, nothing moved inside the longhouse. The fire had sunken now into its deepest state, not dead, but dreaming a red breath beneath gray ash. Then, as if stirred by some quiet agreement between the body and the sky, Ellen opened her eyes. She did not wake with a start. There was no gasp, no sudden rush of breath. Her eyelids simply lifted, and the world came back to her like an old friend stepping into the room. For a moment, she did not move. She listened to the house, to the wind, to the deep, slow rhythm of her husband's sleeping breath. Then, with the care of a snowflake landing on wool, she sat up and pulled the shawl back around her shoulders. This was the waking between. It had no name in their language that still lived today, but in the old tongue, there were whispers of it. The middle sleep, the night's breath, the turning hour. It was not a problem to be solved, not a disruption, not insomnia. It was expected, welcomed even. A time to think, to pray, to tend, to simply be. Ellen rose quietly and moved toward the hearth, where she uncovered a small clay pot and poured in water from a skin hanging nearby. She blew softly on the coals and added a few slivers of dry pine. The flame responded with a faint flicker, just enough to color the underside of the pot. The scent of resin and smoke rose gently, blending with the cold. She sat again, knees drawn up, and closed her eyes while the water heated. Across the longhouse, a shuffle. Arnketil stirred, groaned lightly, and turned onto his side. Then, after a long pause, he too sat up. He blinked toward the hearth and saw her silhouette outlined in the soft glow. "You're up," he said, his voice low and half asleep. Ellen didn't turn. "You are too." He chuckled softly and rubbed his hand across his face. "Dreams? No, just the stillness." He nodded as he always did. It was enough. Arnketil stood, joints cracking in protest, and wrapped a fur over his shoulders. He moved to the bench beside her and lowered himself slowly, letting out a satisfied grunt as he sat. She poured a bit of the now warm water into 2 wooden cups, dropping into each a pinch of crushed herb, not for strength or healing, just for warmth. The steam carried the soft scent of elderflower and juniper. They drank in silence. This, too, was part of the sleep. This moment of stillness between the layers of night. It was when the body rested in a different way, not with unconsciousness, but with presence. The fire whispered, the wind sighed against the roof, and they, 2 souls carved by time, sat wrapped in fur and memory, surrounded by sleeping wood and glowing stone. After a while, Ellen spoke. "Do you remember the winter when Snorri's father was small and the snow came all at once in a single night?" Arnketil smiled faintly. "We had to climb out through the roof. You carved stairs into the drift with the cooking ladle." He laughed then, quietly, his shoulders shaking. "That ladle never recovered." "No, but neither did I. My knees ached all that season." He looked at her, the firelight catching the edge of her profile. "You never complained." "I didn't need to." "You heard it anyway." That, too, was enough. Minutes passed. then more. The water cooled, the fire brightened and dimmed again, and beyond the walls of their quiet world, the stars turned slowly in the great dome of black and frost. Snorri stirred now, in his sleep. A small sound escaped him, not fear, not speech, but a dreaming hum, the kind a child makes when caught between running and flying. Arnketil glanced over but did not move. He watched. The boy rolled onto his side, nestled deeper into the hide, and settled again. A long, slow breath escaped him. Ellen followed her husband's gaze. "He's strong. He will need to be," Arnketil replied, not unkindly. The world they lived in did not promise ease. The snow that blanketed the world also crushed roofs and froze fingers. The silence they cherished could also swallow voices. Life here was a balance, not a battle, but a constant agreement between giving and taking, between accepting and preparing. That is why sleep mattered so deeply, not just as recovery, but as communion with the body, with the land, with time itself. After a long silence, Arnketil stood. "I'll check the animals," he said quietly. Ellen didn't argue. She only handed him the fur he had left behind. He moved to the heavy door, unlatched it gently, and stepped outside. The air struck his face like a hand made of glass, sharp and biting, but clean. The snow reflected the moonlight like silver cloth, unbroken except for the soft indentations left by the last wind. He crossed to the small outbuilding where the goats were kept, checked their hay, added fresh straw, and whispered calming words into the dark. Their breath rose around him like ghosts. He lingered a moment longer outside, staring at the horizon where the hills met the stars. Somewhere, a fox barked once, sharp and brief. The wind replied with a sigh. And then, content, he returned. Inside, Ellen had already returned to her place beside the hearth. Snorri slept deeply now, a faint smile curled at the edge of his mouth. Arnketil lowered himself once more onto the bed, pulling the hide over his chest, and let his eyes fall shut. And once again, the second sleep came slower, deeper than the first. Not because they were tired, but because they were ready. Not because they had earned it, but because they had not forgotten how to accept it. The second sleep passed like a river through still wood, slow, soundless, and certain. No one marked its beginning, no one marked its end. It simply moved through the room and the bodies in it, weaving through breaths, touching dreams without disturbing them. Outside, the moon passed behind clouds, and the clouds drifted across stars that did not blink. The night was long, but not empty. It was filled with something deeper than sound, something older than silence. When morning finally hinted itself, not with light, but with a subtle shift in the air, it felt less like a beginning and more like a continuation. The longhouse slowly exhaled, not all at once, first with a creak in the roof beams, as if the wood had noticed the change. Then with a sigh from Ellen, who shifted beneath the furs and pulled her shawl tighter before opening her eyes. Arnketil stirred next, murmuring something inaudible as he sat up, scratching his beard. Snorri was last, reluctant as always to leave the warmth of sleep, blinking in the dimness that was not yet day but no longer night. There was no rush to rise. The world outside remained draped in darkness, though the sky had softened by a few shades. A deep slate gray hovered behind the small vent where cold air slipped in, unnoticed most nights, but suddenly curious now. Ellen moved first, lighting the morning lamp with a practiced motion, tipping the wick just enough to coax flame without smoke. The scent of beeswax mixed with the faint lingering of last night's fire. Arnketil opened the shutters slightly, not fully, just enough to see the color of the sky and the shape of the trees. Snow clung to the branches like fur. The air looked heavy with more to come. They dressed in layers: wool, leather, and fur, not for appearance, but for warmth, for movement, for life. Each garment carried memory. Ellen's coat was lined with scraps from her mother's first loom. Arnketil's boots had been mended so many times their soles were more stitched than hide. Snorri's mittens had once belonged to his father, the thumb still to long for him, flopping slightly when he waved. The day began not with noise, but with ritual. Water was heated, porridge stirred, the goats were fed and checked for frost on their ears. A fishing net thawed beside the hearth. None of it was dramatic. All of it was vital. By midday, or what passed for it in these dim months, Arnketil took Snorri out onto the frozen path that led to the edge of the fjord. They walked without speaking, the snow crunching beneath their boots, breath rising like faint smoke. The boy's cheeks flushed red from cold, but he did not complain. He held his grandfather's hand in one mittened paw, swinging it occasionally. As they walked to the water's edge, the world opened up in silence. The fjord stretched wide, black and glassy, framed by cliffs whose tops vanished into mist. Ice crept along the shore, but hadn't yet conquered the center. The wind moved gently here, brushing snow from rock faces and carrying the faint smell of salt and pine. Arnketil pointed to a formation of ice near the rocks. That ridge, see how it curves inward? That's where your father once slid off the path with a full sled. Took us 3 hours to dig it out. Snorri grinned. Did he cry? No, Arnketil said, smiling. But he sang the whole time, loud and terrible. They sat on a flat stone, their breath steaming. Arnketil handed the boy a strip of dried fish wrapped in cloth. Snorri chewed quietly, watching a ravenwheel overhead. The bird called once, twice, and then vanished into the gray. This place, Arnketil said, teaches you how to listen. Snorri looked up. To what? Arnketil paused. To everything you think doesn't speak. The boy tilted his head, as if trying to hear the snow. Later that day, as twilight approached, though it never quite left, Ellen prepared a tea of dried herbs and honey, pouring it into carved wooden cups and handing one to each of them. The warmth crept into their fingers before it reached their chests. The light faded again. Shadows lengthened, and once more, the fire was tended, the shutters drawn, the door barred. The rhythm began again, not from urgency, but from habit. Not because they were weary, but because the world invited rest. Ellen swept the floor slowly. Arnketil covered the tools. Snorri nestled against the furs, already drifting into that half-state where the body remains while the mind loosens its grip. And just before the light was extinguished, Ellen glanced at the flame, then at the small wooden figure resting near the hearth, a carving of a bear, worn smooth by years of holding. She placed it gently near Snorri's hand. Outside, the snow fell again, soft and soundless. The longhouse breathed in, and the night, vast and quiet, returned like a friend long awaited. The wind rolled down from the high cliffs like a forgotten god, old, wide-breathed, and watching. It spoke not in thunder or storm, but in that low, endless hush that moved through pine trees and over snowdrifts, turning branches into harps and rooftops into whispering skin. The fjord below lay frozen, its waters captured mid-motion, sealed beneath a glimmering crust of ice that stretched from one shadowed edge to the other. Only the crows moved, black flickers against the pale sky, and even they moved carefully, as though mindful of the silence. In a narrow valley between two steep hills, where the sun reached only a few hours each day in winter, sat the settlement of Hjalvik, a cluster of 5 longhouses and a single watchtower made of dark stone, its top ringed with soot and moss. The people of Hjalvik did not number many. No more than 40 souls lived there through the coldest moons, but they lived closely, their days bound together like threads in wool, tight, strong, and warm. Among them was a woman named Freydis. She was neither the oldest nor the youngest, not the strongest nor the swiftest, but she was known deeply, widely in that way some people are, where their name becomes part of the air you breathe. Freydis the midwife. Freydis of the quiet hands. Freydis who spoke to dreams. No one remembered a time before her, and few dared to imagine one without her. Her presence was as expected as snowfall, and as steady as the tide before ice. Her longhouse stood closest to the pinewood edge, half covered in ivy even in winter, its roof pressed low beneath snow, an animal curled against the cold. The smoke from her hearth rose thin and straight, a sign of good kindling and better sleep. Within, the walls were lined with dried herbs hanging from woven twine, their scents curling in the warm air like ghosts of summer. She slept near the rear of the house, beneath a roof beam carved with runes no one else in the village could read. When she woke, as she did each day, just before the coldest hour, she did not stretch or sigh. She simply opened her eyes, waited for her breath to steady, then sat up and placed her feet on the floor. Her skin met the cold wood without flinch. She was not young, but her body had learned to move without question. She lit a small flame and passed her hand through its warmth, not to test it, but to greet a dot in the room beside her. Old Kjartan coughed softly, then mumbled in his sleep. He had been staying with her for 5 nights now, recovering from a fever that had swept through half the valley. He was nearly well. His dreams were no longer sharp with fear. Freydis had seen to that, with crushed Valyrian and songs whispered in a language no one else remembered. She rose, cloaked herself, and stepped outside. The sky above was soft with snow not yet fallen. A great blanket of gray stretched from one horizon to the other, and the cold set like a weight across the shoulders of the world. But it was beautiful, the kind of beautiful that hurt, the kind that reminded you the earth could be cruel and still be sacred. Freydis walked down the gentle slope toward the stream, where a hole had been chopped through the ice for water. She knelt, scooped it into a clay pitcher, and paused to listen. There it was, the pulse, not her heart, not the stream, not the wind, something older, the rhythm that lived beneath everything. She had first heard it as a child, in the quiet hours after snowstorms, when the world had not yet remembered how to make noise again. Over time, she had learned not to speak of it, not because it frightened her, but because it didn't frighten others enough. Some things were meant to be listened to, not explained. She stood, returned to her house, and stoked the fire with practiced hands. The room brightened, not into daylight, but into life. She poured water into the iron pot, added bark and root, then turned to check on Kjartan. He slept deeply now, his breath even. She pressed 2 fingers to his wrist and nodded. His pulse matched the one outside. By mid-morning, the others came. First, little Torin with her red cheeks and frostbitten thumb, clutching a doll whose face had faded with time. Then Egil, barely 4 winters old, with a cough that rattled like loose stones. Their mothers followed, tired-eyed and grateful, their voices low from broken sleep. Freydis welcomed them without word, opening her arms and her door in one motion. This, too, was part of the sleep, the community's rest, not just the stillness of night, but the healing of bodies, the restoration of trust. In this village, sleep was not isolation, it was shared space, woven together through habit, care, and knowing. The children curled up near the hearth while their mothers stirred the pot and whispered news, not gossip, but weather, animal signs, small omens noticed. In the snow, Freydis listened, always listening. By afternoon, she had tended to 6 people, fed 3 more, and mended the sole of a young man's boot whose mother had passed 2 winters ago. She did not charge them. They brought her meat, wool, candles, or silence, whatever they had in abundance. That was the law of Hjalvik. Give what you can, take what you need, sleep when the earth sleeps. As the sun slipped behind the hills once more, or perhaps it had never fully risen, the shadows in Freydis's longhouse grew longer. The fire, now low and steady, glowed like the breath of something ancient, coloring the beams above with red and gold. The children had long since gone, carried home in the arms of their mothers. Even the wind outside had grown still, as if pausing to listen to the soft crackle of pine and birch. Kjartan stirred and sat up slowly. His beard, matted from sleep, caught the light and turned silver. Freydis handed him a wooden cup of the root broth she had brewed earlier. He drank without speaking, then wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. I dreamt of the old stones, he murmured, his voice still wrapped in the fog of rest. The ones near Skald Hollow. Freydis raised an eyebrow. The ones shaped like doors? He nodded, holding the cup between his palms. But they opened, and what was inside? He paused. Sleep, but not like ours. A deeper one. No breath, no dreams, just stillness. She said nothing, just stared into the fire. Dreams like that were not to be dismissed. Not in midwinter, not when the nights were long and the veils thin. Kjartan finished the broth, handed her the cup, and lay back down. His breath slowed, his eyes fluttered closed. Soon, he was sleeping again, more easily now, like a boat drifting back into calm waters after a storm. Freydis stayed near the fire, She did not always sleep in two parts. Some nights she remained awake through the middle, watching the shadows change, listening to the whispering creaks of the beams and the weight of snow sliding off the roof. There was wisdom in that time, not the kind that came from thought, but from stillness. Many of the old midwives had told her, the world speaks loudest when no one is listening. That night, she heard something she had not heard in years. A knocking, soft, distant, rhythmic, like someone tapping a hollow bone against stone. She turned her head, listening carefully. It came again 3 times, then silence. She rose slowly, walked to the door, and opened it just a crack. The snow outside was untouched, the moon hidden behind a veil of cloud. She heard nothing more, but the cold rushed in like a whisper. Not a scream, not a threat, just a reminder. You are not alone here. She closed the door, placed another log on the fire, and returned to her furs. Sleep did not come quickly, but it came, like it always did, like it always will. That night, she dreamed of her mother's voice, calling her from the far edge of the woods. She walked barefoot through snow that didn't sting. The trees bowed as she passed, and above her, the stars burned not white, but red, pulsing like embers, humming like breath. When she woke, the sky had shifted. Morning, what little of it there was, waited behind the clouds. Kjartan was gone. He'd left before dawn, as quiet as he had arrived. But in his place, near the hearth, he had left a small bundle wrapped in wool, a bone carving shaped like an owl, its wings folded, its eyes closed. A gift of thanks, and of remembrance. Freydis smiled faintly and placed the owl among her collection of figures, not idols, not quite, more like memories that had hardened into form. Each one held a moment, each one had a place. She began her morning again, water, fire, herbs, and waited for the day to begin its slow dance across the gray sky. Later, as she walked to the village gathering hall, a low round building built half into the earth, she passed the house of old Ivar, who sat just outside his door sharpening a bone needle. Your fire's been bright lately, he said, without looking up. It's been cold, she answered. He nodded. Cold calls things out of hiding. She paused. Have you heard knocking? He stopped sharpening, looked up. His eyes were pale, almost the color of smoke. Yes, he said. 2 nights ago, just before the fox screamed. She nodded slowly, and walked on. Inside the hall, a few of the village women were weaving, their hands moving in practiced rhythm, their feet keeping time with a song only they could hear. Freydis sat among them, taking up a spindle and thread, though her mind drifted. Sleep was not just rest, it was a door. She had always believed that, and she had walked through it many times. But now, something knocked from the other side. That night, she prepared differently. She did not drink her usual tea. She laid no extra log on the fire. She darkened the windows, extinguished all lamps, and lay flat on her bedding, arms at her sides, eyes open. She waited. The house was utterly still. The darkness was whole, thick, unbroken. She let her breathing slow until even her thoughts moved softly, and then she heard it again. The knocking. Closer this time. 3 knocks. A pause. Then 3 more. Not at the door. Not from outside. From within the wall. She did not rise. She did not call out. She only closed her eyes and let herself drift downward. Not into sleep, but into stillness. She awoke, but not as one usually does. There was no line between dream and waking. No clear break in thought or breath. It was as if her body had risen while her spirit remained somewhere deeper, quieter. The house was still dark. The fire was cold. Her limbs were stiff, but her mind moved gently, as though wrapped in mist. Freydis sat up slowly and looked around. Nothing had changed: the walls, the furs, the carved owl near the hearth. But something felt different, as if the air itself had been rearranged while she slept. Then, she noticed her hands. Her palms were dusted with ash. She stared at them in silence. She hadn't touched the hearth during the night, hadn't moved at all. She was certain of it, and yet, here it was, a fine layer of black across her skin, the smell of smoke beneath her fingernails. She rose without haste, stepped over to the fireplace, and saw that a thin trail of soot led from the edge of the coals to the wall. The same wall where she had heard the knocking. She knelt. pressed her palm flat to the wood. Cold, silent, whatever had come in the night had come quietly, respectfully, or perhaps not at all. That day, the sky brightened briefly, a few pale golden rays slipping between parting clouds, enough to cast long shadows over the snow-covered roofs of Hjalvik. Children laughed in the open courtyard, throwing clumps of hardened snow at each other, while goats bleated from the pens. Men hauled firewood from the forest. Women tended to clothes stiff from washing. Life continued, untouched by what moved silently in the corners of the long night. Only Freydis seemed changed. She walked slower that day, not from age, but from thought, as if each step stirred something. Beneath the snow, people noticed, they always did, but no one asked. In Hjalvik, questions were like knives, useful when needed, dangerous when not. In the evening, she visited the watchtower. Few climbed it in winter, the steps were narrow, the wind sharp, and the view mostly white and gray. But she climbed anyway, wrapped in her thickest cloak, hands tucked into her sleeves. At the top, she looked out across the land, the hills, the forest, the distant mountains. The frozen fjord gleamed faintly in the last light, and the smoke from the longhouses curled upward like soft threads. She closed her eyes. The rhythm was still there, that low thrum beneath everything, the breath of the land, the sleep of stone. When she opened her eyes again, she saw them far in the distance, just at the edge of the tree line, figures, not moving, just standing. She narrowed her gaze, heart steady, breath calm. 3 of them, no more than shadows, tall, motionless, facing the village, watching. She did not panic. Instead, she stepped back down the tower, each footfall measured, as if descending through time. That night, she prepared a brew unlike the usual, not for healing, not for warmth. This one was for crossing. She lit no lamp, let the fire burn low, draped the owl carving in a scrap of dark cloth, and placed it at the foot of her bedding. Then she drank. The warmth spread first to her chest, then her limbs, then her eyes, which grew heavy, not with tiredness, but with surrender. She lay back, arms folded across her middle, and let the world fall away. What came next was neither dream nor memory. She was standing again, but not in her longhouse. The space was wide, round, and dark. A ring of firelight glowed faintly in the distance, surrounding not walls but trees tall, straight, ancient. Their bark shimmered like wet stone, and the ground was soft, silent. The 3 figures were there, closer now. She could see them clearly, not human, not beast, not spirit. Shapes made of mist and bone, wrapped in cloaks of night. They did not speak, but she heard them all the same. You listen well, she nodded. You remember what others forget. Yes. You keep the silence when others speak, because silence speaks louder. They stepped closer, then one extended a hand, long fingers wrapped in shadow, reaching toward her. She did not flinch. Instead, she took it, and the forest fell away. She woke with a sharp inhale, but not from fear. The fire had gone out. The room was dark, but her body was warm, her breath even. She sat up and touched her chest beneath her tunic. Her skin was cool, but her heart beat strong. Then she looked down. Beside the owl figure, wrapped in her shawl, was something new. A stone, small, smooth, dark green, unlike any stone from the fjord, the forest, or the stream. She picked it up. It pulsed faintly in her palm, as if holding the memory of a heartbeat. She placed it on her shelf, beside the others. Another memory, another message. Outside, the wind picked up again, soft and rhythmic. The people of Hjalvik would sleep well tonight. They did not know why. They did not need to. Freydis would keep watch, and the watchers would wait as they always had at the edges of forest, dream, and dusk. The wind that swept across the northern coast that morning was different. It didn't howl or bite like the late winter storms. It moved gently, like breath, pressing through the tall dry grasses and stirring the snow from the lower rocks, brushing against the cliffside with a touch that felt almost deliberate. The sea, visible far below, rolled with slow swells, its surface dark and vast, touched here and there with the pale sheen of early light. This part of the coast, jagged and rarely trodden, had a quiet that could only come from centuries of solitude. Seabirds wheeled silently over the black stone bluffs. Nothing cried out, nothing rushed. High on the ridge, where the cliffs bowed inward like old shoulders, stood a solitary house. It was not large or grand, not different from the other homes in the region. Its roof was pitched steeply to shed snow and rain. Its timbers, grayed by salt and wind. Smoke rose in a thin, disciplined thread from its chimney, curling against the morning sky. The stones at the base were ancient, older than the house itself, fitted together so tightly that even the sharpest wind could find no purchase. Someone had built it carefully. Someone had loved it enough to make it last. Inside, the air was warm, rich with the scent of cedar smoke and seawater dried herbs. A fire whispered gently in the hearth, its light painting the fur-covered floor and smooth wooden walls with slow, flickering gold. A kettle rested beside the coals, and the steam that curled from its spout moved like a breath not yet taken. A man sat near the fire, sharpening a narrow blade with smooth, measured strokes. He moved without hurry. Each pass of stone over steel made a soft, predictable sound, a rhythm that matched his breath. His name was Eric Thorson. The people of the nearby fjord village called him Eric the Quiet, not because he never spoke, but because when he did, the silence around him seemed to deepen, as though the world itself paused to listen. He was in his 40s, broad-shouldered and deep-eyed, with hair the color of oak bark and hands scarred by rope and fire and years of carving. He had been a shipwright once, one of the best along the coast, known for building vessels that rode the sea as though born from it. But now, for reasons only a few in the village knew, he built no more ships. He lived alone, tended his small garden, fished the sea, and kept the old rituals. This morning, like all mornings, he rose before the sun and stepped outside into the wind. He filled his lungs with the salt air, felt the cold sting his skin, and closed his eyes. It grounded him, cleared whatever fragments of dream still clung to the edges of his thoughts. Then he returned indoors, stoked the fire, and brewed his tea. It was always the same blend: dried meadowsweet, a sliver of dried apple, and a pinch of crushed bark. Bitter, but clean. It warmed the chest, soothed the joints, and perhaps most importantly, sharpened the mind just enough to carry the silence of night into the hours of waking. He drank it slowly, then set the cup aside and returned to the blade. He wasn't sharpening it for use, not today. It was a ritual. The sound, the motion, the repetition. Each day began this way. It helped him listen, not just to the wind or the sea, but to the world beneath them. There was something about the cliffs, something about the way the stone seemed to remember. He felt it most in the early hours, before the gulls cried and the tide reached the base of the rock. He had felt it for years, but never spoke of it, not even to Freydis, though she had surely sensed it too. They had spoken once about such things, about the pulse in the earth, and the dreams that came not from the mind, but from somewhere older. That had been years ago, before he moved up to the ridge, before the loss. A soft knock came at the door. He paused, set down the blade, and turned. No one knocked here. Not unless it was something important, or something strange. He rose, crossed the room, and opened the door. Girl stood there, bundled in furs too large for her frame, her cheeks red from wind and walking. Her eyes, though, were wide and calm. She looked up at him, her breath visible in short, steady puffs. "You're Eric," she said. He nodded. "I was told you listened to things most people can't hear." He studied her, not with suspicion, but with the quiet patience that made even silence feel full. "I listen," he said. She stepped forward and held out her hand. It was a piece of stone, small, green, smooth, just like the one Freydis had found. Eric took it gently, turned it in his fingers. It was cool, almost unnaturally so. "Where did you get this?" he asked. The girl looked over her shoulder, back toward the forest line, and shrugged. "I don't know. I just woke up holding it." Her voice was steady, not frightened. He gestured her inside. She sat near the fire, cradling a warm mug in both hands while Eric studied the stone. It pulsed faintly in the palm of his hand. Not a glow, not a sound, just a presence. He opened the small carved box on the shelf beside the hearth and removed a matching piece. Green, smooth, cool. He placed them side by side. They pulsed in rhythm. The girl's eyes followed every movement. She wasn't afraid. She was waiting. Eric turned to her again. "What's your name?" "Alva," she said. He nodded. And so began a winter neither of them would ever forget. The days that followed passed in a rhythm older than speech. Eric did not ask Alva many questions, and she did not offer many answers. She remained in the house on the cliff without fuss, as if she had always belonged there, quietly observing the sea and helping with whatever needed doing. She swept ash from the hearth in the mornings, rinsed the drinking horns in icy spring water without flinching, and walked the rocky paths down to the shoreline with bare, silent feet. She did not complain about the cold, nor the isolation. In her silence, Eric heard something familiar, a steadiness he had not known in years. Each morning, Eric would rise before the frost had melted and sit on the edge of the cliff. Sometimes, Alva would join him, wrapped in furs, staring out at the sea. She did not speak much, but when she did, it was never idle. She asked about the tides, the shape of the clouds, the way the wind shifted when snow was coming. Eric taught her what he knew, but often, she simply nodded as if the answers had already been inside her, waiting to be named. A night, after the fire was banked low and the sea's hush grew heavier, Alva would take out the green stone and place it by her bedding. Eric did the same with his. They would sit in silence, watching them, listening to the soft rhythm that had no sound. It was like watching the breath of something sleeping deeply beneath them, not dead, not distant, just resting. Eric began to dream again. Not ordinary dreams, not the kind that faded with waking. These were heavier, slower. They came in layers, as if he was descending into a place with no floor. He dreamed of long staircases carved from salt, of bells that rang underwater, of trees that hummed when no wind touched them. Always, in these dreams, he saw Alva younger, older, and changed, standing beside him, holding her stone. One night, he woke to find her sitting upright, eyes wide open. "The Watchers," she said softly. "They're waiting." He didn't need to ask who she meant. He had seen them once, long ago, 3 shapes by the tree line, still and watchful. He had never spoken of it to anyone, not even Freydis. But now, hearing the words from Alva, he felt a stillness spread through him like ink in water. "They wait in the gaps," she said, "between thoughts, between breaths, between sleep." She looked at him, then truly looked, and there was something in her gaze that unsettled him. Not fear, not sorrow, but recognition, as if she knew something he had forgotten. The next day, Eric walked down into the village, the first time in many moons. His boots crunched over ice and gravel, his breath clouded the air, and people turned to watch him as he passed. No one greeted him with shouts or laughter. That was not their way. But they nodded quietly, as if acknowledging something heavy. He found Freydis outside the smokehouse, sorting dried herbs into cloth pouches. "You've seen her," he said. Freydis didn't look up. "She found her way to you?" "Yes. She carries it well," Eric nodded. "She has the other stone." Freydis smiled faintly. "There are more." They stood there for a long moment, the silence between them thick with memory. "I've been dreaming again," he said. "So have they," she replied. 3 others have come to me this week. Children, a woman from across the ridge, an old man who hasn't spoken in years, all waking with stones, all with the same dreams. "Something's coming," Eric said. Freydis finally looked up. "No, it's waking." He returned to the cliff with more questions than answers. Alva waited at the edge of the hearth, stoking the fire with practiced hands. When she looked up, she already knew. "Others feel it now." He sat beside her and placed the stone in the center of the floor between them. She did the same. The stones pulsed, their green surface almost seeming to breathe. That night, the knocking returned. Not at the door, not from the walls, from below. 3 deep pulses, then silence. Eric rose, stepped outside. The wind was calm. The stars glinted like ice. But beneath his feet, he felt it a deep vibration, like something shifting from under the rock. He looked toward the forest. The tree line was still, but he knew they were there, waiting. That night, he did not sleep. Neither did Alva. They sat by the fire wrapped in furs, and watched the flames rise and fall. In the shadows, shapes moved, not threatening, not close, just observing. The world had grown thinner. By the next evening, quiet expectancy had settled over the village. The air carried a strange stillness, as if even the animals had paused to listen to something moving just beyond the reach of human hearing. Dogs slept curled beneath carts and did not stir. Children played less loudly, and the elders sat longer around their hearths, saying little, watching the coals burn low. Eric spent the afternoon gathering dry birch bark and placing extra stones around the edges of the fire. Alva swept the floor again, though it was already clean. Her movements were slow, not tired but careful, like someone preparing for a guest long expected, but never named. As dusk fell, a cold mist crept up from the sea, veiling the coastline in shifting gray. The lanterns in the village blinked on one by one, their warm orange glow blinking like distant stars through the fog. But up on the cliff, Eric did not light the lamps. He let the darkness come. Alva sat across from him near the hearth. Between them, the two green stones pulsed in slow, steady rhythm. Their light was not bright, just enough to catch the edge of a shadow, enough to remind the body that something was alive within them. "We're close," Alva whispered. He nodded. "Do you know what they are?" "No," she said, "but I remember them. In the way you remember a song before you hear it." Eric understood. He had built ships in silence once, trusting hands that remembered more than thought. This was like that, a craft without words, guided by something deeper. He lay down that night not out of tiredness, but because the rhythm called him. Alva did the same. They placed the stones near their heads and closed their eyes, and sleep took them, but not gently. It came in waves, not crashing, but vast, folding over them again and again, till the sense of self thinned to a single thread drifting beneath the surface. They found themselves in the forest again, but not the forest they knew. The trees were larger, older, their bark black as coal, their roots breathing under the moss. The air shimmered. The silence was not empty, it was watching. They walked together. Eric's steps were soundless. Alva's figure flickered slightly, as though not fully anchored. The three watchers appeared again, closer now. No longer distant shadows, but beings made of something not quite light, not quite form. They spoke without voice. "You are listening." "Yes." "You are waking." "Yes." "There is more to be heard." They reached out their long fingers again. This time, instead of a stone, they offered a thread, silver, impossibly thin, floating in the air. Eric reached for it and felt warmth flow through his chest. Not heat, not fire, but recognition. As he grasped it, the forest fell away. He opened his eyes. The room was still dark, but the fire had returned, not the one he had banked with stones, but a clean, white flame in the center of the hearth, burning without smoke, without heat. Alva was still beside him, eyes wide open, breathing steadily. The stones had changed. They no longer pulsed green. They were glowing silver. Outside, the mist had thickened. Through it, figures moved slowly, deliberately along the ridge line toward the village. Eric rose and stepped outside. The air hummed, not with sound, but with weight. Something beneath the earth was stirring, like breath drawn before a word is spoken. Alva joined him. She didn't ask what came next. They both knew. By morning, the villagers would feel it, some in dreams, others in their bones. A few would wake with stones in their palms. Others would speak in sleep. The rhythms would return, not as myth. As memory. The watchers had waited long enough. The land itself was stirring, and those who listened, those who slept in the old ways, who honored the dark and the silence, would remember. That night, Hjalvik slept deeper than it had in 100 years, not in fear, but in preparation for something old, something kind, and something vast enough to speak only in dreams. The first full snowfall came softly, not with the roaring blizzards that sometimes swept down from the mountains, but with the hush so complete it changed the sound of the village itself. Roofs thickened with layers of white that dampened every step, every door creak, every whispered word. Even the sea, so often a voice in the distance, seemed to have quieted, lulled into stillness by the weight of winter's breath. Across Hjalvik, people moved slowly, wrapped in wool and furs, shoveling paths with curved wooden blades, placing pine branches across thresholds, and lighting the oil lamps earlier each day. It was a season not only of cold, but of listening. The world, buried under frost, had begun to whisper differently. Freydis knew it from the moment she stepped outside that morning. The sky was a pale gray, heavy with light that never seemed to fully arrive. She breathed in, and the air tasted older. Beneath the layer of snow, the land felt deeper, not just colder, but thicker, as though something underneath had shifted, making space. In the branches of the bare birch trees, crows watched silently, too still for the morning hour. Everything, in her bones, her breath, her memory told her that the rhythm was changing again. She walked slowly toward the water's edge, following a trail she hadn't touched in weeks. Her boots sank with each step, the snow rising to her calves, but she kept moving, not with urgency, but with quiet purpose. At the fjord's edge, the water moved sluggishly beneath the fragile crust of ice. Thin sheets cracked and rearranged with soft pops, like distant echoes of speech. She stood for a long time, looking out at the water that had once brought raiders and traders and drifting ships from far coasts. Today, it brought only mist and the smell of pine smoke from far inland. Behind her, someone approached. She didn't turn. She didn't need to. "I saw you in the dream," came the voice. It was a young man's voice, soft but firm. Freydis turned and saw him tall, lean, with a red wool scarf wrapped high across his mouth. His eyes were sharp, wide, and sleepless. "You woke with one too?" she asked. He nodded and held out his hand. A stone, pale gray, nearly white, smooth and oval, different from the green ones, but the same size, the same texture, the same silent pulse. "Your name?" she asked. "Lars." "How long have you heard it?" "Since the snow began." She looked down at the stone. "This one's different." "I know," he said. "It doesn't pulse like the others. It hums." Freydis didn't ask more. She simply nodded and turned back toward the water. The threads were beginning to weave now, different pieces from different places, all pulling in the same direction. That night, the fire in her home burned a little brighter. Not from more wood, she had added no extra logs, but from something in the air. The flame danced higher, more slowly, as if lifted by unseen breath. She sat near it, eyes half closed, not yet asleep, not yet fully awake. She remembered a winter from her youth, one not unlike this, when her grandmother had spoken of the veils between sleep and waking, thinning with snow. "The silence," she had said, "is not absence. It is presence waiting." At the time, Freydis had thought it a riddle. Now, she felt it in her bones. Outside, a storm had begun, but not the kind that howled. It came like the shifting of mountains, quiet, slow, inevitable. The snow fell in such density that the air seemed to vanish, and all that remained was white, like the space between dreams. In Eric's house on the cliff, the rhythm was changing too. The silver stones no longer pulsed. They shimmered not brightly, but steadily, as though holding a breath. Alva noticed it first. She had spent most of the day drawing circles in the frost on the windows, not out of boredom, but as if mapping something remembered only through the hand. "The stones have stopped sleeping," she said. Eric looked at her, then at the fire, and started what? "I think." Listening, she placed one of the stones near her ear, and her eyes widened. "There's a sound," she said, "like thunder, but far away, beneath everything." Eric took the stone and did the same. He heard it too, not loud, not frightening, a deep, slow sound, like stone shifting under water. They didn't sleep that night in the usual way. They sat near the fire, the stones between them, listening, and the storm continued. By morning, the village had changed. Not visibly, the houses still stood where they had always stood. The goats still pawed at their troughs. The smoke still rose from the hearths, But something had softened in the people. Voices were quieter, movements slower, as if the air had grown thicker and everything required more care. In the smokehouse, Freydis met again with Lars and two others who had come with similar stones, a middle-aged woman with hands calloused from weaving, and an elder named Bringer whose eyes had long since dimmed, but now gleamed with an unfamiliar clarity. All had dreamed of the same place, a circular grove surrounded by standing stones, a fire burning without smoke, and figures just beyond the edge of the trees. They compared no notes. They simply spoke in turn, and their words wove themselves together. Bringer's voice was gravel, but steady. In the dream, I knew I had been there before. Freydis nodded. You probably have, but not in this life. No one questioned her. That evening, the group walked together to the edge of the village, to a clearing rarely used in winter. There, beneath the pale orange sky, they placed their stones in a circle on the snow-covered ground. The stones didn't glow, they didn't pulse, but the silence they created was unmistakable. It was the kind of silence that comes before a song begins, the kind that hums just beneath the skin. Alva and Eric arrived late. As they approached, the stones shimmered faintly, and the firelight from Freydis's lantern bent subtly around them. No one spoke. They simply stood in a ring watching. No one spoke. They simply stood in a ring watching. Then, without a word, the snow inside the circle began to melt. Not from heat, from memory. As if the ground itself remembered being warm. And so, for the first time in known memory, the people of Hjalvik stood together in silence, not in mourning or in fear, but in attention, listening to something ancient, returning. The warmth that returned to the earth that night was not from fire or sun, but from something beneath, deeper than the roots of the pines or the frost within the soil. As the snow within the circle melted, it revealed the pattern of stones not placed, but grown. Smooth rings beneath the surface, perfectly etched into the earth, like the marks of something breathing slowly in a forgotten language. No one had carved them. No one remembered their making, but they had been there, waiting, preserved beneath seasons of ice and ash and footsteps. Alva reached toward one of the patterns and pressed her fingers into the damp earth. Her eyes didn't blink. She didn't recoil. She simply touched it like someone meeting something they had only known in dreams. The others stayed silent. Even Bringer, who trembled slightly from the cold, held his breath. They're waking, Alva said. She wasn't speaking to Eric, or to Freydis, or even to herself. It was as if she spoke to the ground. The silence that followed stretched long, and then so faintly that it could have been imagined. The air changed, not in temperature or scent, but in weight. A stillness that thickened, that pressed. The watchers were near. Eric turned slowly. At the edge of the clearing, three shapes stood again, neither human nor beast, nor shadow, but something that moved without moving. They didn't approach, they only watched, their presence a soundless drumbeat in the skin, a quiet gravity in the chest. Freydis stepped forward and bowed her head slightly. We remember, she said, and the figures faded, as though drawn back, into the folds of snow and mist. Afterward, no one said what they had seen, not because of fear, but because there was nothing left to explain. Each person walked home in silence, carrying a stillness they hadn't known they needed. Some slept more deeply that night than they had in years. Others woke often, not out of anxiety, but with the sense that someone was whispering gently just beyond the veil of sleep. Alva did not sleep at all. She lay beside the hearth, eyes open, the silver stone in her hands. It no longer pulsed. It hummed not in the ears, but somewhere deeper. She could feel it moving with her breath, as though it had synced itself to her completely. Eric watched her from across the room, quietly preparing the morning tea, though dawn was still hours away. You don't need rest? He asked. I am resting, she said. Just not with my eyes closed. He nodded. She sat up slowly, still holding the stone. I see the grove even when I'm awake now. He didn't ask which grove. He had seen it too. For 3 nights after that, the village remained quiet. Not out of fear. There was no sickness, no storm. But people moved more slowly, slept more deeply, ate in silence. Dreams became stronger. Not frantic or chaotic, but ordered pattern. Some awoke with songs they didn't know how they knew. Others carved shapes into wood without deciding to. Children played differently, building towers and rings, creating circles in the snow, whispering names that hadn't been spoken in generations. Freydis gathered them again by the fifth night. Not by demand, not with any urgency, simply with the quiet word passed from home to home. Come when the sun slips behind the ridge, and they came. This time, more than before, 22 people stood in the clearing as the last light faded. The stones in the circle remained, but their glow was fainter, as if the energy within had been drawn out and now hovered just above the earth. Freydis spoke quietly. There is an old rhythm returning, older than our names, older than our dead. It does not speak loudly, but it waits for us to be quiet enough to hear. She stepped forward and placed her hand on the soil. For many years, we forgot how to sleep properly, how to listen in the dark, how to rise not from alarm, but from rhythm. The watchers have not punished us. They've simply waited. The silence thickened. One by one, others knelt and placed their hands upon the ground. Eric, Alva, Bringer, Lars. Children and elders alike, and together, without any sound, they felt the earth breathe beneath their palms. After that night, things shifted quickly. Sleep became sacred, not just necessary. Families began to rearrange their hours, allowing the natural division of night to guide them. The bifurcated pattern returned: first sleep, then waking, then second sleep. Midnight hours were no longer filled with anxious tossing or worry. People used the time for quiet craft, for quiet prayer, for speaking gently with loved ones. Alva used the midnight hours to sit at the edge of the ridge, eyes toward the stars, fingers curled around her stone. Eric joined her most nights. They didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. The stars above them blinked slowly, and the sea below, even when frozen, still carried the rhythm of something ancient and unbroken. On the seventh night, as the fire settled low, Alva rose and walked to the back wall of the house, a place neither of them had touched in years. She placed her stone against the timber. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wood glowed faintly, not from fire, but from within. She stepped back. The outline of a door appeared, not a real door, not one built by human hands, but a seam, a memory. Eric stood slowly. We've been here before, he said. Alva nodded. The watchers were no longer outside the village. They were here, and they had always been. Eric approached the glowing outline slowly. His hand hovered near the wood, the heat of it rising faintly, not burning but alive. The glow did not pulse like the stones once had. It was steadier than that, like breath held in stillness. He pressed his palm against the line. The wood did not move, but he felt something yield, not in the timber, but in his chest. A gentle pull, not unlike the way dreams softened his body before they took him each night. Alva stood just behind him, watching quietly. There was no urgency, no fear, just presence. Like standing on the edge of something sacred. The outline began to fade, the light sinking inward, folding into the timber like water returning to its source. The moment passed, and the wall was as it had always been, plain, unmarked, cold to the touch. But Eric knew something had changed. The house was no longer just wood and stone. It had begun to remember. That night, their sleep was unlike any before. They did not lie down out of habit, nor because the fire burned low. They were drawn into it, into that rhythm that pulsed not from exhaustion, but from alignment. They closed their eyes, not to escape the day, but to meet something waiting beyond it. And as they drifted, the stones, now dim in color, but alive with warmth, rested beside them, like living embers placed beneath the skin. In the space between the first and second sleep, Eric found himself again in the grove. But this time, it was not distant or dim. The fire at the center blazed with a clean white light, and around it stood others, villagers, children, strangers whose faces were both familiar and unknown. They stood in perfect stillness, breathing as one. And above them, circling like slow stars, were the watchers, not as shadows now, but as forms woven of starlight and soil, of memory and root. Eric stepped forward. So did Alva. and they spoke without words. The message came like wind through pine. The world had grown too loud. Sleep had been broken. The watchers had waited, not to punish, not to conquer, but to offer rhythm back. It was not a lesson. It was a remembering, and the people of Hjalvik were ready. When Eric woke, the sky outside the house was still dark, but the stars were visible, every one of them, as if the veil of snow and cloud had lifted in the night. The air was utterly still. No breeze, no distant surf, no creaking wood, only breath and silence, and something sacred held between them. Alva was already awake. She sat beside the hearth, legs folded, her hands resting gently on her knees. "They showed me something," she said. "So did they," Eric replied. "They're not just watchers." He nodded. "They're reminders." She turned to him. "They remember the rhythm. And now, so do we." The village woke slowly, as it had every morning since the rhythm returned. But this time, something else had spread, a lightness in step, a brightness behind the eyes. Not joy exactly, not euphoria, but alignment. Children who had cried in their sleep now dreamed silently, their faces soft and untroubled. Elders who had once lain awake till dawn now slept into deep stretches, waking only to hum low songs between. The middle hours were no longer feared. They were embraced, a time for quiet, for craft, for reflection. It was as if an ancient muscle had relaxed in them all. Freydis noticed it most clearly, not just in the way people moved or spoke, but in what they no longer needed to say. Fear had softened, time had loosened, even illness had quieted, with fewer headaches, fewer restless nights, fewer wandering thoughts. The village began to hum, not in sound, but in rhythm. No one led it. No one demanded it. It simply grew. As if the land had returned to song, and in the following weeks, more stones were found, not placed in hands this time, but unearthed beneath hearts, under tree roots, inside walls where nothing had been before, each one different in shade and shape, but all sharing that quiet hum. Not all were claimed. Some remained in the circle at the clearing, but for those who kept them near, sleep deepened. Memories returned. Eric began carving again. Not boats, not tools, circles, spirals, symbols he did not recognize but that felt right beneath the blade. Alva watched, and occasionally added her own marks drawn in ash and snow, in circles no one had taught her. They didn't explain them. They didn't need to. They were remembering. By the end of that moon cycle, the watchers no longer lingered at the edge of the forest. They had stepped into dreams, into breath, into the rhythm of daily life, not as ghosts or gods, but as a presence so old it could only be described through silence. On the 12th night after the storm, the snow melted again within the grove. The pattern beneath was wider now. The rings had grown, and at the very center, a new stone had risen, pure black, smooth as glass, silent. But when Eric placed his hand upon it, the ground did not tremble, his chest did. He did not speak. He only looked at Alva. She smiled faintly. "It's the memory of the first rhythm," she whispered. "The one before sleep and waking were ever different." They left the grove together that night, with no need for answers. The rhythm was back, the watchers were listening, and the village of Hjalvik was no longer alone in its sleep. It had rejoined the dream of the world. The thaw came earlier than anyone expected, not with the force of a sudden melt or the chaos of a flood, but with a gentleness that made people stop in their tracks and notice. Icicles no longer clung to eaves by morning. The roofs no longer sighed under the burden of snow. Streams, once frozen solid, began to murmur again, their waters creeping over dark stones like fingers remembering the shape of an old song. Hjalvik breathed, and in doing so, the village felt reborn. It was not spring, not yet, but it was something. Between a moment the old ones might have called the quieting thaw, when winter released its grip slowly, kindly, so the earth beneath would not shatter from the sudden weight of awakening. Fires burned lower at night. Windows, once sealed against the cold, were cracked open for the first time in months. The air that drifted in still held the sharpness of snow, but it carried with it the scent of things sleeping just beneath it. Soil, damp roots, moss, the memory of warmth. Alva was the first to rise that morning, as always. The silver stone beside her pillow no longer hummed as it once had. Its energy was quieter now, not gone, but folded inward, like a secret waiting to be told in a whisper. She carried it to the hearth and set it gently beside the tea kettle, the way others might place a hand on a child's shoulder. Eric stirred. Just as the fire began to crackle, he didn't open his eyes at first. He simply turned toward the sound and let the rhythm of it settle into his bones. "Smells like melt," he murmured. Alva smiled. "It's time." "For what?" he asked. "For what comes after remembering." He sat up slowly. The night had been long, full of dreams that left behind no images. Only impressions: a wide valley filled with wind, a circle of stones sunken into deep moss, the sound of a bell that rang without being struck. Across the village, others were waking too, not in a rush, but in slow, patient waves. First sleep had passed. The middle hour came and went. Now, the second sleep lifted like fog, and with it came a new kind of clarity. Freydis sat beneath the furs of her bed, holding a cup of warmed goat's milk, her thumb tracing the edge of the rim. She hadn't spoken aloud yet, but words stirred in her chest, not words for others, but for herself, like a prayer to quiet, for even the gods to hear. On the floor near her bed, 3 stones lay in a triangle, each a different color: green, silver, and one a soft amber, the shade of tree sap in sunlight. They had appeared days apart, and she hadn't asked why. She only knew they belonged together. She whispered softly, "They're weaving something." In the center of the village, the circle in the grove had changed again. Where once the snow melted only within the ring, now the entire clearing remained bare, as though the weather had forgotten it, or perhaps chosen to protect it. The earth was dry, soft, and alive with the scent of pine resin and something older, something like stone warmed in the sun. The patterns etched into the soil had deepened. Some claimed to see them shifting when no one watched. Others believed the markings responded to breath, to voice, to thought. Lars was among the first to speak openly about it. He had taken to sleeping in the grove, wrapped in hides and wool, under a canopy he built from branches and fish skin cloth. The cold didn't bother him anymore. He said it moved around him like water, touching but never sinking in. Each night, he laid the white stone from his first dream at the center of the spiral, and each morning, he awoke with a new word on his lips. He kept a small book now, carved of birch bark, sheets bound with sinew, and inside it were pages of symbols, none of them known, none of them taught. He said he didn't write them. He said the stones did. The elders, once skeptical, now visited him more often, not to ask questions, but simply to sit in silence. Bringer, whose sight had faded in one eye, said that when he sat beside Lars, the world grew sharper again, not visibly, but in the way his heart understood the space around him. Others brought their stones to the grove too, placing them in quiet arrangements. No one instructed them, but somehow, every new placement made sense. The rings grew wider. The grove was becoming something, not a temple, not a shrine, but a place that listened. Children began to visit it in the mornings, running their hands along the grooves in the soil like they were lines of music. They spoke to the patterns, sometimes in nonsense, sometimes in perfect silence, and the birds, those that had returned early from their migrations, gathered in the branches around them, not singing, but watching. One child, Inga, just 6 winters old, placed her tiny hand on the dark stone in the center and said softly, "It remembers us." And for a moment, every crow in the grove took flight at once, not in fear, in recognition. The villagers said little about such moments. They didn't dismiss them, but they didn't elevate them either. They simply let them pass into memory, adding their weight to the slow building rhythm that hummed now through every corner of the village. Sleep had changed. Not in form, the 2 parts remained, but in quality. People awoke feeling not just rested, but nourished, as if the dreams were feeding something deeper, and they began to share stories. Not the sagas of warriors and kings, but the soft tales passed between sleep and waking, of old women weaving cloth that turned to smoke, of ships made of bark that sailed through the sky, of animals who spoke in riddles. These stories wove through the community like thread in a loom, connecting those who had never spoken before. The smith, who had once worked in silence, began humming while he forged. The widow who had long mourned her husband started planting herbs again, even though the ground was barely soft. The healer began writing names in ash on the backs of leaves, then burning them to scent the rooms of the sleepless. Hjalvik, once quiet out of necessity, had grown quiet with intention, not silence from fear, silence from listening. Eric and Alva visited the grove again on the 7th day after the thaw. The clearing was different. Where once there had been a single black stone, at the center, there were now two, one black and one pale as ivory, perfectly smooth, their edges almost touching. They didn't pulse, they didn't glow, but their presence bent the air around them, like heat over fire. Alva knelt before them and placed her hands palm down on the earth. "They are beginning to speak to each other," she said. Eric sat beside her, watching the light change through the thin branches overhead. "Do we understand them?" he asked. "Not yet, but I think they understand us." She closed her eyes. "And they're patient." That evening, strange scent drifted through the village. Not unpleasant, earthy, sweet, faintly metallic. It came not from any home or fire, but from the wind itself. Those who noticed it said it made them remember things they could not place: a sound, a face, a path through a wood they had never walked. Freda stood on her roof to smell it better. "It's the scent of the rhythm," she whispered, and she began to sing, low and slow, a lullaby her grandmother had once hummed in sleep. Others heard it and joined, not in chorus, but in resonance, each voice finding its own thread. The sound drifted across rooftops, through the grove, across the fjord, and into the woods beyond. It was not a song for gods. It was a song for memory. And the watchers listened. The rhythm was not something the people of Hjalvik heard with their ears. It wasn't a drumbeat or a chant, not a melody passed from mouth to mouth. It moved underneath everything, in the way they breathed, in the way they walked, in the way they stirred their porridge or washed their hands in the cold stream behind the village. It hummed in the marrow of their days. Even the animals seemed to notice. The goats no longer bleated restlessly in the night. The crows, once scattered and shrill, gathered in tight flocks along the ridge and sat for hours without moving. The dogs did not bark in the dark hours, but instead slept curled at the doors of their homes, twitching as though they too had begun to dream in deeper colors. Sleep was no longer a necessity. It had become a ceremony. Not every night brought visions. Not every dream carried meaning, but there was a softness now to the threshold between waking and sleeping, as though the veil had thinned, not to be lifted entirely, but just enough to allow the two sides of life to speak to each other. Children stopped fearing the dark. They no longer cried out for light or voices. Instead, they asked to hear the soft stories before sleep, the old ones, not written or remembered, but rediscovered. Freydis told them of the wind wolves that ran beneath the sea, of the moon that once hid behind the sun out of shame, of the tree that grew upside down, its roots reaching toward the stars. She said she did not invent these tales. They came to her in sleep, and when she spoke them aloud, they felt true. The circle in the grove was no longer only for the villagers. Travelers began to arrive. Not many, just one or two at a time. Quiet figures with tired eyes and strange tokens tucked into their coats. One came with a piece of obsidian wrapped in linen. Another carried feathers braided into their hair. A third arrived with a pouch full of dust that smelled of iron and apples. None of them spoke of how they found Hjalvik. They simply arrived, looked toward the grove, and knew they were meant to walk there. The villagers welcomed them without question. There was no need for introductions. The rhythm recognized them. One night, a man named Solvi arrived just after dusk. His boots were torn at the seams, and his beard was thick with frost. He said he had walked from the east, following the shape of a constellation he hadn't seen in years, one that only became visible after a certain kind of dream. Eric gave him a blanket. Alva handed him a bowl of root stew. Solvi ate in silence, eyes closed, nodding slightly after each bite, as if confirming something with each swallow. When asked what he had dreamed, he said only, a circle of breath, and the watchers blinking in time. He slept that night in the grove, beside the pale and dark stones. In the morning, he was gone. But in the soil where he had rested, a new ring had appeared, faint but unmistakable, like the imprint of a pressed hand or a footprint left by something not entirely solid. The stones were multiplying, not in numbers, in depth. Where once they sat on the surface, now some began to sink of their own accord, disappearing into the soil as if returning home. Others rose slightly, exposing markings along their base, not runes, not letters, but grooves shaped like waves and wind and bird wings. No one tried to translate them. They simply watched, and the watchers watched back. Eric felt it first in the forge. He had returned to his tools slowly, more from curiosity than need. One morning after second sleep, he lit the coals with no clear purpose. He did not plan to make nails or hinges or even knives. He just wanted to feel the heat, to remember the sound of hammer on iron. But when he began, something shifted. He struck not with force, but with rhythm. One beat, a pause, then two in quick succession. He didn't think about it. His body simply knew. When he lifted the iron from the flames, it glowed a strange red-gold color, different than before, and when he shaped it, the metal seemed to move like clay. He forged not a tool, but a shape, a smooth circle, hollow at the center, with 8 points radiating outward like the petals of a windrose. When he cooled it, the steam that rose did not hiss, it sang, a low, soft hum, like the sound of snow falling on stone. He brought it to the grove that night. Alva met him halfway through the woods, as if summoned. She didn't ask what it was. She only reached for it, held it in her hands, and smiled. It belongs, she whispered. They placed it between the two central stones. The ground accepted it, not swallowed, not rejected, accepted like a lost memory gently returned to its place. After that, others began to create, not as duty, not for coin or survival, but because their hands itched when they did not. The weavers wove new patterns without thinking. The carvers etched new spirals into bowls and doors. The fishers tied nets with knots they had never been taught. The blacksmiths shaped rings that seemed to guide their own forging. Creation had become a form of remembering. The watchers never spoke. They never stepped forward, but their presence grew not in size or threat, but in depth. Like gravity, like the pull of sleep itself. You didn't see it, you felt it, and you responded without needing to name it. One morning, a child named Rooney came to Freydis and asked, "Why do they watch us?" Freydis didn't answer at first. She simply looked out across the fields where frost still glittered along the grass. "They don't watch like we do," she finally said. "They remember, and through their remembering, we begin to recall what we were meant to." Rooney tilted her head. "Were we lost?" Freydis smiled softly. "No, just asleep." By the time the equinox neared, the grove had become a quiet pilgrimage, not for worship, for restoration. People came with no request, no offerings. They simply came to sit, to breathe, to remember. And each night, without fail, the rhythm deepened. Sleep came easily, and waking did not feel like interruption. It felt like return. One by one, the old fears of night, of silence, of dreams fell away. The people of Hjalvik had not discovered anything new. They had only found their way back. To the place. Between to the watchers. To the rhythm. To the forgotten dream that had always been listening. The sky over Hjalvik had changed, though no one could say exactly when it happened. The stars appeared brighter now, not in their shine, but in their clarity, as though the air had been combed of its haze, as though the very fabric between worlds had been stitched tighter, but also made more transparent. Constellations once thought forgotten had begun to reappear. The old names, whispered only in cradle songs, stirred again in the voices of the elderly and the dreams of children. The heavens had softened, and with them, so too had the world beneath. Snow still clung to the shaded groves, and the wind carried cold on its breath. But the village did not brace against it anymore. They met the wind the way one meets a returning friend, aware of its sharpness, but grateful for its presence. The seasons had not changed, but the people had. Or perhaps they had simply remembered how to be within the seasons, rather than against them. Eric stood near the edge of the grove one morning just before sunrise. The frost on the ground sparkled like tiny stars caught in soil, and the sky was beginning to shift from deep indigo to a fragile blue. He held a length of cord in his hand, something he'd braided from old nettle stalks and wool threads, woven slowly during his second sleep hours over the past weeks. He didn't know why he had made it, only that he was meant to place it where the stones met. He stepped into the center of the grove. The two stones, one black, one pale, remained side by side, and changed in form, but they held a presence now that was more than visual. People described it differently. Some said the air felt thicker there, as though standing inside water. Others felt lighter, as though breath came easier near the stones. Eric felt neither. He simply felt known, like the ground beneath his feet remembered him, remembered every step he had ever taken. He laid the braided cord between the stones. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost imperceptibly, the wind shifted direction and the frost on the cord melted, not from heat, but from some invisible intention. Alva watched from the tree line, her breath slow and even, not wanting to disturb whatever was unfolding. As the cord settled and the wind moved past, a sound rose, not from the earth, not from the trees, but from within. It was the sound of something recognizing itself. That day, Eric said little. He returned to his home and sat by the fire, carving nothing, mending nothing. He simply watched the flame and let the silence stretch. Alva joined him later, and the two shared dried berries and cheese without a word. In the evening, they slept early, not from exhaustion, but from a need to enter the place between again. Sleep was not escape. It was a meeting. The Watchers had not appeared in many days, at least not in the way they once did, as shadows, as shapes at the edge of vision. But they were not gone. Their presence had folded inward, becoming part of the rhythm, like water that had soaked into the soil. In their dreams, people no longer saw singular images. They experienced textures, feelings, impressions. Eric dreamed of stone warmed by sun, of feathers falling in slow spirals, of soil turning itself over in preparation for something unseen. Alva dreamed of water pressing against wood in perfect stillness, of roots growing upward instead of down, of a hand not her own smoothing her brow in the darkness. These were not messages. They were memories waking. Freitas had begun mapping sleep, not in the way of charts or scrolls, but by marking stones with ink and burying them at the foot of trees. Each morning, she would sit beside a different tree and wait. She said the tree would tell her if the dream was complete or if the memory had yet to finish its return. No one questioned her, and slowly, the trees around the grove began to sprout new shoots, even while frost still kissed the soil. One elm budded early, too early for any season, and from it hung a single curled leaf, gold like it was autumn and spring all at once. She called it the tree of between, not because it had been chosen, but because it had chosen itself. Children gathered around it after their second sleep and told stories with their eyes closed, recalling details no one had taught them, names of rivers far to the north, sounds of animals that hadn't roamed the forests in generations. They did not speak these stories like facts. They offered them like songs from another lifetime, and the trees listened. Each night, the wind carried less urgency. It moved slowly through the village, as if pausing to remember what each home had once smelled like: smoked fish, pine resin, warm wool, wet bark. Eric noticed that the hearths now burned with less effort. Wood caught quicker, coals stayed hot longer. It was as if the fire, too, had joined the rhythm. It did not rush. It did not struggle. It simply burned as it needed to. The old ones in the village began to sleep longer, not out of illness or fatigue, but because their dreams had grown heavier. When they did wake, they often stared into space for long moments before speaking, as if returning from a journey they could not yet describe. One elder, Sigrid, awoke one morning with soil under her fingernails and birch leaves tucked into her braid. She said nothing of it, only smiled and returned to sleep after drinking a small bowl of broth. That evening, a ring of stones appeared around her door, placed not by hands, but by the rhythm itself. the animals continued to change. Not in shape or sound, but in manner. They became quieter. The sheep no longer panicked when startled. The ravens, usually vocal and sharp, began to sit in silence for hours near the grove. One was found standing on the edge of the spiral for a full night, unmoving, its eyes open and calm, its wings relaxed at its sides. In the morning, it flew away, without a sound. People began to walk the spiral at night. Not all, not often, and never the same way twice. There were no instructions, no patterns. They simply entered, walked until their bodies told them to stop, and then sat. Some fell asleep there, others simply breathed. Some wept without knowing why. One woman, Marta, stood at the center for nearly an hour with her eyes closed and her hands raised, palms facing downward. When asked what she had seen, she replied only, "Not with my eyes, with my remembering." By the end of the third week, the grove was no longer separate from the village. The boundary had blurred. The rhythm had grown so quiet, so constant, that no one noticed when it stopped being something you listened for and became something you carried. The second sleep stretched longer. The middle hours became treasured not for productivity or ritual, but for presence. People sat together in silence, not needing to speak, not needing to fill the space with words. They were not avoiding anything. They were simply in the rhythm. On the last night of the month, the sky above the grove shimmered, not with light, with absence. Stars blinked out and reappeared in a slow ripple, as if something had passed behind them, vast, gentle, and aware. The children who were awake pointed without speaking. The elders nodded, some with tears in their eyes. It was not fear, it was not awe, it was recognition. Something had turned. A page, a season, a memory. The watchers did not speak. They never had. But that night, as Eric lay beside Alva in the stillness between sleep and sleep, he felt something press gently against his chest from within. Not weight, not breath, a question, in words, but in knowing. Do you remember? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The watchers already knew. The village slept soundly. Not as individuals, not even as families, but as one, a rhythm finally complete, a song finally returned to its singers. There would be more dreams, more spirals, more silence. But this chapter had ended, not with a closing, but with an unfolding, and in the darkness, the rhythm deepened once more. Long before the first bird sang above the frost-washed roofs of Hjalvik, the rhythm stirred. Not loudly, not suddenly. It moved like a thought you forget you're having, like the warm draft from a hearthstone when you didn't know you were cold. It curled into the spaces between waking and dreaming, brushing against the walls of each dwelling, resting briefly on the brow of every sleeping villager, then slipping softly back into the soil without sound. And no one could say what changed that morning, only that the air seemed more awake, and yet more restful, as if the sky itself had taken a deeper breath. It was not a storm or omen. It was not warning or wonder. It was simply presence, a kind of knowing that arrived without announcement and required no reaction. The sun rose slow and pale, climbing through mist that lingered just long enough to make the light feel like memory. Children who awoke early sat by the windows, not calling out or asking questions, but watching, as if the light itself might explain something they had forgotten to ask. In the grove, the frost clung longer to the spirals etched into the earth, and a new shape had appeared near the center, not drawn by hand, not placed by feet. A curve in the soil, a bowl pressed into soft earth, wide and shallow, collecting the morning mist like water. Alva was the first to notice it. She didn't speak when she saw it. She simply stood at the edge, wrapped in her cloak, her breath slow and even, letting the shape tell her what it needed. She traced the outer rim with her toe and found that it was warm, not from sun, not from fire, but from something deeper, something like memory made tangible. Eric joined her quietly. He held nothing in his hands, brought no offering, said no words. But when he stood beside her, he reached out slowly, and she took his hand without looking. Together they stood there, not seeking answers, only listening for the quiet between the wind and the frost, the space where the watchers waited. In recent days, Fewer people had been speaking aloud. Not from sadness, not from illness, but from a shared understanding that much could now be said without words. The weaver, Ingrid, who once sang with every stitch, now worked in silence, yet her threads moved as though guided by unseen music. The smith, who once struck iron to mark time, now shaped metal as if molding thought, each curve echoing something half-remembered from a dream. Children played in spirals without shouting. Elders nodded to one another with eyes half-closed. There was less need for names. The dreams had shifted to and no longer singular, no longer personal. People awoke with the same images, not identical, but overlapping. A forest of stones, a sea that breathed, a ring of lights that pulsed with breath. When they shared these visions around fires or over bowls of broth, no one questioned their meaning. They were not symbols to decode. They were truths returning in pieces. Freydis began writing again, not on bark or hide this time, but on thin plates of slate, smoothed and warmed in the coals before she traced them with bone. Her hands moved slowly, patiently, as though copying a script that came not from her mind, but from the very silence that had grown so familiar. The symbols she wrote were not Norse, nor Roman, nor any tongue ever spoken. But when others saw them, they nodded, not in understanding, but in agreement, as though they had seen these shapes before long ago. In the cradle of sleep or the curve of a shadow across the ceiling, one plate she buried at the base of the tree of between, another she placed near the shallow bowl of mist in the grove, the third she gave to a traveler who arrived just after dusk, walking with bare feet across frozen ground as though it were soft moss. He said nothing, took the slate with bowed head, and vanished before sunrise. No one searched for him. The rhythm knew where he had gone. That evening, a soft vibration moved through the village. Not a sound, not a tremor, but a sense of feeling of something vast moving gently beneath the world. Like a whale swimming beneath thin ice. People paused mid-step. Children stopped playing. Dogs turned their heads toward the west, ears twitching. Then it passed, leaving only calm. That night, sleep came faster, and second sleep came richer. Eric dreamed of hands not his own weaving threads of starlight between stones, pulling them into patterns that hummed when touched. Alva dreamed of a sea with no waves, its surface flat as obsidian, reflecting a sky full of spinning suns. Freydis dreamed of a spiral staircase descending into a pool of mist, where voices rose not in language, but in feeling welcome, return. Yes, and in the center of the grove, while the world slept, the bowl of mist overflowed, not with water, with memory. A fine vapor rose, slow and twisting, curling through the trees like smoke that had forgotten fire. It carried no scent, made no sound, but wherever it passed, dreams deepened, and the rhythm pulsed once more like the beat of an old, waiting drum. The next morning, those who walked through the grove found themselves pausing near the bowl, not to look into it, but to feel. Some said they heard distant music. Others described the sensation of falling without fear. One child laughed and said it felt like hugging a thought. That day, the sky remained cloudless from dawn to dusk, a rare thing for the season. Birds flew in perfect circles above the fields. Even the river flowed more slowly, as if to match the pace of the rhythm. Hjalvik no longer looked like a village. It looked like a listening dot in the western woods. Lars the Wanderer returned. He had been gone for weeks, following the curve of the moon as it dipped and rose. When he came back, he carried no pack, wore no shoes, and his eyes held the color of distant snow. He did not speak, but placed a single item at the edge of the grove, a smooth disc of pale stone, marked with 3 interlocking spirals. No one knew what it meant, but when it was placed beside the bowl of mist, the mist responded, curling around the stone like a breath drawn in. That night, the Watchers returned, not in form, not in shadow, but in song. It did not echo through the trees, nor rise into the sky. It came from within. People awoke in the middle hour and found themselves humming, mouths closed, voices moving beneath the skin. A melody they had never learned and yet always known. It moved from home to home, winding like a river, gentle and whole. Eric and Alva sat beside their hearth, eyes closed, not singing, not listening but remembering. The rhythm had opened something, not a door, not a path, a memory, of who they had been before forgetting, of what had watched before names, of how silence had always spoken, and how, at last, they had begun to answer. It was not the sun that woke them anymore, nor the cold, nor the needs of daily life. The people of Hjalvik now woke to something quieter than sound, deeper than light, a pull from within, like a thread gently tugged in the dark, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply inviting them to rise. Even the animals rose with the same quiet certainty. The goats moved from their shelters with soft steps, their breath rising in curls that shimmered in the morning air. The hens stirred without clucking, as if some dream still lingered in their feathers. Dogs stretched, yawned, and padded to their doorways, not to bark or guard, but to listen. The rhythm had deepened so much that it no longer felt like something outside the body. It was within now, a second pulse beneath the heart, a second breath under the lungs. People moved through their days, not with urgency, but with the same patience they once reserved for rituals. Every act was slower, not sluggish, deliberate. Chopping wood became a kind of meditation. Weaving became prayer. Even silence had texture, like woven cloth pulled between two hands. One morning, Alva rose from her bedding and stepped barefoot into the frost. She walked not toward the grove, but toward the river. The path wound past the tree of between, past the still sleeping homes, through grasses tipped with white. She did not dress for the cold, and yet the wind did not chill her. It passed through her like breath through a flute. The river was half frozen now. The surface caught in soft waves of ice, like ripples paused mid-motion. She sat on a flat stone at the bank and listened. The sound of water moving beneath the ice was slow and distant, like voices speaking from the other side of a dream. She closed her eyes and let her thoughts wander. When she opened them again, there was a figure across the river, not standing, not moving, simply there. She did not know if it was one of the watchers. It had no form she could describe, only presence, tall, still, quiet. The shape of awareness. She did not speak, neither did it. They simply watched one another across the slow-moving water until the mist thickened and the figure faded like smoke. When she returned to the village, her breath smelled faintly of pine. That night, she placed pine needles in the fire. The smell filled the home, clean, sharp, familiar. Eric said nothing, but his eyes glistened. He too had seen something by the water, not a shape, a knowing that something vast had opened, and they were only just beginning to see its edge. The bowl in the grove continued to change. It now held not just mist, but light, pale, golden, weightless like sunlight reflected off fresh snow, though no sun touched it. At night, it glowed softly, pulsing with the slow rhythm that matched the second sleep. People stopped trying to explain it. They simply visited, stood quietly, and left offerings without thought. Carved bones, folded cloth, a feather, a seed. No one disturbed the items. Yet each morning, they were gone, and in their place, the bowl glowed a little brighter. Freydis had begun dreaming in full sentences. She would wake and recite them aloud before she could forget. Alva, sitting with her in the early light, wrote them down with soot and bone ink. We are not the first, nor the last. The rhythm waits. It always waits. There is no gate, only the memory of having passed through one. We dream not forward, but inward, and the center listens. Some mornings the dreams would be longer. There was a city before the sky, built not of stone but of rhythm. Its towers were breath, its halls were sleep, its doorways opened only when forgotten. The watchers are not guardians, they are echoes, waiting for the note to return. No one asked where the words came from. They knew. Each night now began earlier, not by the sun's descent, but by a quiet shift in the air. Even the youngest children recognized it. They would grow silent near dusk, wrap themselves in wool, and retreat to their bedding without a word. Second sleep became the true heart of night, a place, not just for rest, but for reunion. Couples would wake side by side in the still hours, hands finding each other without sight. Elders would sit near the hearth, eyes closed, breathing slowly, remembering things they had never been told. And sometimes, someone would rise quietly, walk to the grove, and sit beside the bowl until morning. The watchers returned more often, now, still silent, still unseen, but their presence thick in the dark, not like fear, like gravity, like the weight of something remembered. It was one such night when the ground itself began to shift. Not a quake, not destruction, a slow, inward turn, as if the earth had taken a deep breath and was now exhaling centuries of silence. The spiral at the center of the grove deepened. What was once shallow became a smooth descent, just a few finger widths deeper than before, but unmistakable. Moss grew in perfect curves along the edge. Stones appeared at the bottom, each carved with lines that shimmered faintly in moonlight. Not glowing, but remembering light, Freydis placed her hand upon one and whispered, "It's listening." No one asked what she meant. They all knew now. One morning, a boy named Hawk walked into the grove with his eyes closed. He found the center with sure steps and lay down in the bowl of light and mist. He slept for hours while people watched in reverent silence. When he woke, he sat up slowly and said, "They showed me a forest inside the stars. It was full of names, but they weren't words. They were shapes, feelings. I think one of them was mine." After that, others began to dream of the forest and the stars. It became a place no one had seen, and yet all remembered. Branches that bent like rivers, leaves that glowed not with fire but with thought, creatures that watched from the trees. Not beasts, not spirits, but memories. The kind that watch over you while you forget and wait to walk you home when you're ready. The stars above the village began to shift again, not in brightness, but in arrangement. The old constellations remained, but new ones emerged in between. Spirals, circles, arcs. The villagers didn't name them. They let them remain unnamed, allowing the shapes to speak directly to the rhythm within. That winter passed not in hardship, but in quiet abundance. Food stores held. Fires burned long. Illness came gently and left without grief. Even grief itself felt different, no longer heavy with loss, but full of presence. When old Sigrid passed in her sleep, the entire village sat in stillness the next morning. No tears, no speeches, only breath, shared and slow. And that night, a third stone appeared beside the bowl, small, rounded, and warm. The watchers had received her, and the rhythm deepened once more. By the time spring whispered through the thawing woods, Hjalvik was no longer simply a village. It was a remembering, a place where sleep had opened the doors that waking had sealed shut, a place where time folded like fabric, and dreams whispered the truths that the world had once forgotten how to say. And still, the rhythm waited, not for answers, for return. By the time the first shoots of green pierced the softening soil of Hjalvik, the rhythm had become more than a feeling. It was now part of the land's breath, woven into the roots of the trees and the stones beneath the sleeping platforms. People no longer spoke of it. They no longer needed to. The silence that held its shape in the darkness had become language enough. Every breath in the second sleep hours was a kind of word, every glance a sentence, every gesture a paragraph. In a book no one had written, but everyone remembered reading. The snow no longer resisted the sun. It surrendered in slow sighs, retreating from the tree trunks, dripping gently from the eaves of longhouses, sliding down hillsides as if bowing before the return of warmth. The thaw did not rush. It moved with the same patience that had come to define the people. Even the rivers seemed to stretch before resuming their course, as though waking from their own deep sleep. In the grove, the bowl of mist remained, but now, the mist rose even in daylight. It did not behave like vapor. It did not scatter in the wind or dissolve in warmth. It held its form soft, silver, almost weightless. Visitors would stand near it and find their thoughts slowing, their breath lengthening, their bodies growing lighter. No one tried to contain it. No one tried to understand. The bowl was not a mystery to be solved. It was a reminder. And around it, the earth began to hum, not a sound the ears could hold, but a pulse you could feel in your heels, in the soles of your feet, in your bones. Freydis called it the remembering beneath, and others simply nodded. knowing what she meant without needing to understand the words. Eric placed his hand on the soil near the bowl and felt a slow rhythm, deep and wide, like the heartbeat of something older than the world itself. Dreams had shifted again. Now, they came not as images, but as places full, inhabited, real. People awoke with the sensation of having returned from somewhere, and though they couldn't always describe it, they carried its calm into waking like the scent of pine clinging to wool. They spoke of halls made of light, forests where leaves whispered their names, fields where the wind spoke in tones older than language. Alva began walking farther from the village, following paths that hadn't been used in years, not to escape, but to listen. The woods welcomed her with quiet openness. The birds did not scatter. The trees creaked softly, not in warning, but in greeting. She followed the slow curve of the land until she came upon a clearing she had never seen before, round, rimmed with stones, the grass at its center shorter than that around it, as though pressed by something vast and invisible. She sat there for hours. She could not explain why, and when she rose, her hands were warm though the ground was cold. Later that week, a new child was born, the first in many months. His mother, Runa, gave birth just before midnight, the second sleep yet to begin. As the boy entered the world, the fire in their longhouse flickered blue for a single breath, before returning to its soft amber glow. No one spoke of it, but those present felt it, the presence, the shift. The boy, when placed at his mother's breast, looked not around the room, but upward, toward the beams, toward the sky beyond, eyes open, focused. They named him Linner, which meant echo. The name was not chosen. It was heard. That night, the bowl in the grove glowed slightly brighter, and the mist curled inward, as though folding something into itself. The animals began to follow their own strange rhythms. Cattle grazed in spirals. Hens laid their eggs in different corners each day, forming shapes that mirrored the carvings on Freydis stones. Dogs gathered by the grove each dusk and sat quietly facing the western sky until the stars emerged. One night, a fox walked straight through the village, unhurried, unafraid. It stopped near the tree of between, looked toward the bowl, and then vanished into the mist that had begun to spread wider now, gently spilling past the grove's edge and curling between homes. People no longer questioned their role in the pattern. They knew. They were not the keepers of the rhythm. They were the remembered. One morning, the stars remained visible long after the sun had risen, pale against the bright sky, but clear. The villagers gathered in silence to watch. A ring of stars above the grove glowed faintly, not brighter than others, but more certain, like eyes open in sleep, like sentinels, not watching out, but watching in. Freydis carved the shape she saw into a flat stone and placed it near the bowl. A week later, it was gone. In its place, a perfect spiral of ash, unburned, unscented, lay beneath a fresh sprout of moss. The children now spoke less of games and more of dreams. One child, a girl named Elisa, began sketching her dreams into the dirt with a stick. Her drawings grew more complex each day. Spirals within spirals, lines intersecting at impossible angles, circles that looped into themselves without end. She said they were maps, not of places, but of remembering. Her parents let her draw. The others watched, and slowly, her maps began to resemble the stars. Evening became sacred, not through ceremony, but through stillness. Families sat together as the last light faded. No words, no fire, sometimes not even food, just presence. The hour before sleep became an exhale that stretched across the whole village, softening the edges of the day, making room for the dreams that followed. Second, sleep deepened. Waking became gentler. Even time itself seemed to bend, stretching long between tasks, curling in around the moments no one noticed before. The steam rising from a wooden bowl, the sound of frost melting from a roof, the hush before the first footstep in snow. One morning, the river sang. No one knew how else to describe it. The ice had fully melted, and the water moved, not in gurgles or rushes, but in tones long, drawn out, low and high, as though the current carried not just water, but memory. Alva, standing at the bank, wept without sadness. She said the sound had reminded her of someone she had never met, but always known. Eric listened and closed his eyes. The tone vibrated in his chest. The grove glowed brighter that night, not visibly inwardly. You could feel it now, standing even a few paces away. A warmth behind your ribs, a light behind your eyes. Not a warning, a welcome. And in the dreams that followed, many saw the same thing. A circle of figures, neither human nor watcher, standing around a pool of light. Their hands were raised, not in offering, but in recognition. And from the pool rose a spiral made not of light, not of mist, but of memory. A braid of all that had been forgotten, winding upward toward a sky full of listening. When people woke, they did not speak of it. They simply smiled at one another. The rhythm had entered them completely, not just in sleep, but in breath, in silence, in life. And somewhere far above or far within, the watchers listened and remembered too. The wind that moved through Hjalvik in those days had changed. It no longer pushed or whistled. It brushed soft and intentional, as if it had learned something in its travels and returned not to disturb, but to share. When it passed through the thatched rooftops or curled under doors, it carried not cold or warning, but memory. The kind of memory that comes not from thought, but from presence. A knowing you feel in your skin before you understand it in your mind. The season had shifted again, not marked by the usual signs of warmth or bloom, but by a deepening stillness. Days were longer, but time felt slower. Mornings stretched out like threads of honey across the fields. Evenings arrived not with shadows but with softness, like the hush that settles just before a beloved voice speaks. People moved with care, not caution, reverence. Every footstep felt placed in rhythm, every act imbued with a quiet attention. There was no fear in the village, only the awareness that they stood near something vast, something ancient, something waking, not with sound, but with silence. In the center of the grove, the bowl had deepened again, visibly, dramatically. But those who stood near, it felt a gentle pull, as if gravity had leaned slightly inward. The mist still curled upward, and now it carried faint sparkles, not light, not fireflies, but flecks of something not quite seen with the eyes. Freydis called it the shimmer, and though none could touch it, many dreamed of it, tiny drifting pieces of memory suspended in stillness. Elisa, the child who mapped her dreams, now drew spirals not just in dirt, but on stone. Eric helped her carve them slowly, using tools that hummed when they touched the surface. The sound was faint but clear, not like metal scraping, but like breath caught in a hollow reed. Her patterns grew more complex and more familiar. They echoed the stars. They matched the constellations that now turned gently above the village, not the ones taught by elders, but the ones felt behind closed eyes. Alva no longer sought the watchers. She no longer needed to. She understood now that they were not beyond the trees or behind the stars. They were within, in the spiral of breath, in the pause before words, in the rhythm between thoughts. When she closed her eyes in second sleep, she no longer dreamt of distant forests or glowing halls. She dreamt of Hjalvik, exactly as it was, and yet, as it had always been. One night, during the still hours between first and second sleep, the bowl in the grove overflowed, not with water, not with mist, with light. It did not burst. It poured slowly, rising like fog, drifting across the ground in silence. It moved through the village without touching walls, slipping instead through cracks and open windows, around doors and under beams. It touched skin without warmth, filled rooms without weight, and wherever it passed, people slept deeper. They breathed in time, their dreams synchronized. Like chords played on the same string, they all saw the same image, a spiral descending, not down into earth, but into self. And at the center, a light so quiet, so still, it did not shine, it listened. They awoke without waking. They moved without motion, and the rhythm carried them, not away from their bodies, but further into them, into the part of self that remembered not the past, but the before. In that shared dream, there were no names, and no language, only memory, shared, seamless, whole. The next day, no one spoke of the dream. They didn't need to. Their eyes carried it. Their movements reflected it. The way they touched objects, the way they exhaled before beginning a task, the way they looked up into the sky, not to ask, but to thank. Even the land seemed to respond. Grass grew in new spirals. Water settled into curves it had never held before. Clouds lingered longer above the grove, forming rings that dissolved only after dusk. The air was thick with presence, and still, the rhythm pulsed. Not faster, not louder, just deeper. One evening, as twilight brushed gently against the treetops, Eric and Alva sat together beside the bowl. Neither spoke. Eric placed his hand upon the earth. Alva placed hers atop his, and beneath their palms, they felt not soil but warmth, a steady, living pulse that rose not from roots, but from memory. A voice rose within them, then not spoken, not heard, but felt. You are not becoming, you are returning. And they understood. The Watchers had never come from beyond. They had never traveled across stars or stepped from the shadows. They had always been here. In breath. In rhythm. In remembering. Freda's carved her final stone that night. A perfect spiral enclosed in a circle. She placed it at the center of the bowl just before second sleep. And as the village drifted into dreams, the bowl dissolved, not vanished. Dissolved like mist warming in the morning sun. Like snow melting into still water. In its place remained only a patch of bare earth, smooth, warm, listening. Over the following days, life in Hjalvik continued. The goat still needed feeding. The field still needed turning. Children still played. And old bones still ached. But everything was quieter now, not in volume, but in mind. Even the young ones, who once raced and shouted through the forest paths, now moved with the grace of wind through pine. There was no ceremony. No farewell. No ending. Just presence. A continuation. The people of Hjalvik had not witnessed a miracle. They had not been visited. They had remembered what they were. What had always waited. What still listens, just beneath the skin of the world, pulsing gently, asking nothing but breath. And so they breathed. Together. In silence, and the rhythm echoed on.